Hello everyone, and welcome to the 40th plagiarized episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Andrew Wilson from Electronic Arts. The head honcho of one of gaming's greediest companies, the same company voted worst company in America twice in a row, in 2012 and 2013 respectively. And even over a decade later, their reputation hasn't improved. While EA's problems precede Andrew Wilson's rise to CEO, I think it's important to take a step back and assess how we all got here to begin with. Today, we shall look into the story of the CEO of one of gaming's most detested companies, and see if Andrew Wilson is the instigator or merely a byproduct of bad, greedy business practices. Andrew Wilson was born on the 7th of September 1974 in Australia. I live not too far away from where this scumbag was born, and I'm ashamed to say that I have to share the same nationality as him. Anyways, Andrew Wilson got his origins helping EA make sports games. In fact, before he was CEO, he was the head of EA Sports, and was responsible for the ever-declining standards of sports games. So you already know this guy's mentality when it comes to making games. Anyways, when John Riccitiello stepped down as CEO of the company in 2013, right after the company landed itself 2 back-to-back awards for worst company in America, Andrew Wilson took the realms. And well, there's plenty of external blunders when it comes to Electronic Arts and their games in general. While Andrew Wilson can likely not be blamed for the anti-consumer practices featured in the release of Mass Effect 3, given that was the year before, that game was only a sliver of what was to come. We're going to have to split this into chunks, so let's look at each aspect of Electronic Arts under the leadership of Andrew Wilson, and see what problems we come across. First, let's talk about EA Sports. For a long time, EA held the exclusive rights to brands such as FIFA, Madden, and so on. The sports titles were definitely the prime example of EA's collective greed. FIFA and Madden released every year, but as the games kept coming, they were mostly just roster updates, rather than a new and improved game. There are probably a few things tweaked, but aside from that, it's the same game as the year before. This came full circle, with the Switch versions of FIFA being panned across the board for being the same game, and even IGN of all outlets decided to dunk on the games by copy-pasting the same review for a game that didn't change anything from last year. On top of that, the games commonly come out unoptimized, which is baffling given it's literally made with the code of a game that was originally made years ago. FIFA and Madden are known for using the same recycled animations year after year, and sometimes they even forget to plaster the label of FIFA current year everywhere in the game, so sometimes players spot the last year's title on the current game, which only confirms that they're the same game. Now, if all of that wasn't bad enough, here comes the worst aspect of these sports titles: monetization. FIFA, or as it's known nowadays as Football Club given EA didn't want to pay FIFA the money to renew the license, is known for an egregious, blatantly unfair mode known as Ultimate Team. Ultimate Team is basically a mode where you build an optimal dream team and compete with that team against other players. Sounds simple, but the catch is that it's a pay-to-win system, meaning that you can spend money on in-game coins in order to buy packs to open players. If you're filthy rich, you can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on FIFA packs. In fact, those who have done the math estimated that it's either 2.5 years of straight gameplay with no breaks, a few months of trading, or spending roughly $110,000 to acquire the best players, like Lionel Messi and whoever else is good at soccer. This is also topped with horror stories of families whose kids bought hundreds of dollars worth of microtransactions without realizing what they were doing and sucked the bank accounts of their parents dry. In some cases, third parties helped them recover the money, but in other instances, Electronic Arts kept the money. With these risks existing, Andrew Wilson has done the bare minimum to make sure stuff like this doesn't happen. This isn't helped by the fact that EA Sports titles are given an E for everyone rating, or PEGI 3, depending on the region. The games, manipulated by Electronic Arts to the ESRB, are coerced to not see the games as gambling simulators and instead turn a blind eye to a blatant issue in these games. While EA has publicly gone on about how kids should not be spending in their games, they typically don't have a practical explanation for why they sell the games to kids in the first place. EA executives have been interviewed over the years, and they failed to come up with adequate arguments, and to governments catching on to these practices, because the Netherlands and Belgium disregarded their arguments. You've probably seen the jokes of excuses EA executives and spokespeople have made. One of the most infamous examples is the woman who tried testifying to British Parliament that loot boxes are quite ethical and quite fun, comparing them to Kinder Eggs, and also making the false claim that EA didn't call them loot boxes, but surprise mechanics. Which anyone who followed EA on Twitter will know that's not true. They've tweeted in the past about loot boxes, like with Battlefield 5 and Jedi Fallen Order. We'll get to those games later, but point is, EA is utterly incompetent at arguing that loot boxes aren't gambling. It's purely a means of making money, and EA knows exactly what they're doing, but they refuse to let go of their shady practices because EA and loot boxes go hand in hand. It's what you see with a lot of companies, where they typically have a core strategy to making money. A prime example being how modern Rockstar Games focuses on making one game every couple of years, while raking in the success of their current game for years. In a similar vein, EA is dedicated to selling microtransactions because it makes a lot of money. It's a sustainable way of making revenue at the cost of ethics. It may not be easy to abandon it and find another source of revenue, but EA will face backlash until they change their ways. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about the next point of contention. When it comes to Star Wars under Electronic Arts, they were beyond disinterested and negligent. On top of cancelling numerous games, including one being developed by Amy Hennig, they've only released 4 major titles over the course of a decade. The 2 reboot Battlefronts and the 2 Jedi games. And to say that there's been a rocky foundation would be an understatement. Battlefront 2015 was a complete waste of the Battlefront license, stripping most of the features from Battlefront 2 back in 2005, and removing basic things like a campaign and galactic conquest. They also locked most of the player base out of updates through an expensive season pass, which was practically half the content locked from the base game. It wasn't a good look, but the sequel Battlefront 2 somehow ended up with more animosity. While the game conceptually was a huge improvement over the predecessor, with more maps, game modes, 3 eras, and a campaign, it was stifled by one key blunder: loot boxes. Yeah, around this time, EA was trying to expand their Ultimate Team model into other franchises. Hence why Battlefront 2 came with loot boxes that clogged up the progression, unless you paid up. The thing is that they vastly underestimated the Star Wars fanbase compared to the sports titles, and this resulted in politicians getting involved, and EA eventually backtracked. The game was slowly improved after a while, but dear oh dear, what a shit show. The first, mostly controversy-free release was Fallen Order 2 years later, and Jedi Survivor, aside from polish problems, was also praised. But aside from that, EA completely ruined the Star Wars license with their indifference and greed. It's worth noting that nowadays, Star Wars games aren't made exclusively by EA, but with everything we've learned, it should have been like that to begin with. You can tell Andrew Wilson didn't care much for Star Wars anyways, and cancelled games along the way that would have increased the EA Star Wars library. I should probably mention now that EA has tried to spin the narrative that single-player games are on the decline to justify live services, with EA proving itself wrong with titles such as Fallen Order selling incredibly well, and other external examples as well. It is worth noting in recent years that Electronic Arts has tried to push for more single-player games made by them, and that's a good thing, but you can tell if EA had their way, they would proceed to make live service games only. But still, the Dead Space remake, for example, was well received, and EA should make more games like it. With all that being said, let's talk about the next topic. So DICE hasn't been faring much better. After the huge success that was Battlefield 1, it's been way downhill from there. Battlefield 5 was announced to mass ridicule, mostly because of the weird characters who don't belong in a game about World War II. One of the developers basically said it was because he has a daughter, and he didn't want her to feel left out. So he decided to push for women in the game, without regard for historical accuracy. It was a gross misunderstanding of who actually plays Battlefield. The game backtracked from all the monetization it was planned to have, and we were left with a mess of a game that underperformed, and not enough people were playing. It did get a big Pacific Theater update, but that wasn't enough. And their final content update was introducing a discount Tom Cruise as a character before moving on to the next game. So now we arrive at Battlefield 2042. The game was an absolute joke. Unpolished and inconsistent tone, the game died even faster than Battlefield 5. And something I want to note, in case you didn't notice, EA under Andrew Wilson has been pushing for live services in every single franchise that they own. That's why Command & Conquer was turned into a mobile game. The problem is that EA is not making good enough games for an already oversaturated market. Every other company had the exact same idea EA has. So their live service endeavors, out of the entire history of EA, have mostly been failures. There was the previously mentioned Battlefield 1, but that's a once in a full moon success. The two follow-ups after that failed big time. It might actually be another reason they're trying to make more single-player games now, because they somewhat realize that they suck at making live services most of the time. Anyways, this is getting off topic, so let's now talk about the next aspect. BioWare is nowhere as good as it used to be. Anthem is perhaps their biggest blunder, a game that was announced with fake gameplay, and then built extremely quickly based on that fake gameplay. From what I understand, the game was grindy, despite feedback pleading for the game to be more rewarding when a glitch actually made it so. An underwhelming story, and overall, a game that failed. They found themselves in a stump with their recent releases. And I, in particular, don't have much faith in the next Mass Effect. Andromeda, from what I hear, was smeared with controversies, and the game was discontinued anyways after it launched. It was an utterly inferior spin-off to the Mass Effect trilogy in general. Now, in regards to Dragon Age, from what I understand, the newest game was originally intended to be a live service game, of course, but then it launched with a lot of changes made, and the final result was messy. I'm not really interested in the Dragon Age game, so I can't definitively say, but from rumblings that I've heard from the average player and hardcore fans that I've seen, that's the issue with it. So Anthem was the biggest blunder, but to say it was the only one would be quite wrong. And under Andrew Wilson's leadership, BioWare is a shell of what they once were. I used to play Knights of the Old Republic for a long time as my only game when I first tried it. The Mass Effect trilogy, much of the same thing. But it seems like with every studio, there's always oversaturation and lack of commitment to making the best game possible. Or there's just bad decisions made. In either case, that's BioWare in its decline under EA. So that's the major aspects I've touched on, but there's still a lot more. Command & Conquer Rivals was the bane of players' existences, and it was really only seen as a reminder that the series died with Electronic Arts. A personal burn came from Andrew Wilson himself. Moments after the game was announced, Andrew Wilson came up on stage and declared it Command & Conquer for a new generation. In that same conference, Andrew Wilson did everything to downplay the evil ways of Electronic Arts, announcing that they had raised money for charity, which is good, but it's clear that it was out of sheer pragmatism. And Andrew Wilson tried to make excuses for the way he runs EA the second afterwards. It was clearly an engineered and deliberately timed announcement. In the numerous interviews, in fact, he's consistently pushed the supposed ethics EA has of value, fairness, choice, and fun. He's preached those words on more than one occasion, and he typically has nothing to show for it. For the longest time too, EA didn't directly engage with criticisms made about them face to face, and one of the few times they did, it was deflective. Now, I think Andrew Wilson knows that his business practices are reprehensible, and that he's done the bare minimum to fix the problems that wreak his company. Now, EA started these greedy practices before there was a huge question posed about whether they constituted gambling. But given how profitable it was, EA did everything to stave off politicians. I can't even say for certain whether Andrew Wilson or not is actually a gamer or just a business executive, but I'd say he's the latter. Now, there might be some nuance to the greed, where EA is required to please investors, and it's difficult to come up with an alternative to shady microtransactions. But on the other hand, that's a mess EA found itself in to begin with, by implementing microtransactions in sports games and whatever the fuck else. And that doesn't mean you still can't make single-player games. Again, it's a good thing that EA has shifted their range a tad bit, but it's still not good enough. It's easier to make an incessantly monetized sports games that nickels and dimes you, more than creating the best sports game ever made. That's also why they release sports titles annually, so they can keep consistent profit every year for the base price of the game itself. Andrew Wilson did inherit a company rife with these problems, but he has done little to change it. Valuing investors is understandable, but Andrew Wilson seems to care more about them than actual gamers who also give EA money. Now, I'm not a business executive, and I can see how Ultimate Team's monetization would be a difficult thing to give up, but EA hasn't really tried to find an alternative that could make them the same amount or even more money. They've just ignored the backlash and tried to insist that it's players' choice. But if it were really up to the gamers, they would cease to be in the games altogether. EA made the choice for us. It's EA's choice to continue these practices. Now, I've been very hard on Andrew Wilson, and while he does deserve it, I can say that EA isn't necessarily the evilest video game company. Even though they hold that spot for many people, they've somewhat adapted to the feedback that they need to make more games that aren't live services. And on top of that, there is the EA Originals program, which is universally regarded as one of the bright spots of EA, where indie developers got funding from Electronic Arts, and the developers got to control what the game is like instead of EA. So I wouldn't say that Andrew Wilson isn't completely without a heart. There is a slither of a desire to make good games, but it's often overshadowed by the prospect of ripping players off. With all that being said, it's easy to conclude that Andrew Wilson inherited an already hated company and continued their practices because it made the company money. And when the overload of live services started to falter and fail, he then relented to making more single-player games. And I can say at the very least that he continued the EA Originals program instead of shutting it down. So there is some empathy for indie game developers. With that being said, however, that's too many controversies that make Andrew Wilson, an undoubtedly remarkable, evil. Thank you for listening to this episode of Analyzing Evil. What do you think of Andrew Wilson? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories by mystery boxes?